Okay, next up is legal issues. LGBTQ youth experience unstable housing, face many legal hurdles that include knowing their rights and navigating the legal system. Some of the key words in regard to this is access to legal counsel, name and gender marker changes, and encounters with the law enforcement. Sharing the recommendations as well as the discussions of this weekend is Owen Daniel McCarter. Come on down.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I should introduce myself a bit, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So my name is Owen. I do a couple of things. One is that I'm one of the collective members and co-founders of the Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois, which is a collectively run, entirely volunteer organization that works primarily with transgender people who are criminalized throughout the state. So a lot of our clients are people who are in correctional facilities right now, Cook County Jail, or in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Hello. And we also run a monthly name change program, which everybody should know about. It's a free program at the Daily Center on the last Friday of every month, where we help people change their names in Cook County who are residents of Cook County, including homeless folks, including young people, which is complicated by parental consent rules, etc. But we work with folks all across the board, and again, it's entirely free, so you can refer people there. Last Friday of the month, Daily Center, 12th floor. I also am staff attorney and legal director for the Trans Life Center, so I'm running a legal program that's very new for Chicago House and Social Service Agency, doing direct service work, policy work, running a legal drop-in clinic, and really also trying to change some laws in connection with some of our biggest allies like Land Legal and the ACLU of Illinois. So, what we found overwhelmingly from our talks with young people is that when we ask people the question, what do you think of law, or how do you define law, what is law? Overwhelmingly, the response was criminalization, police, law enforcement. People were not thinking about emancipation rules, about eviction laws, about how law connects to funding for all different sorts of things. They were really, really clearly traumatized and felt really disrespected across the board by interactions with police. And some of the suggestions for that really it was a range of suggestions. One was we should have LGBT police officers, particularly transgender identified police officers, that there should be consistent ongoing trainings that are required for police, including trainings on LGBT sensitivity, but also trainings on racism, trainings on ageism, trainings on how to interact with young people, particularly folks who might have experienced a lot of violence in their lives, who may be in DCFS for that very reason. And to have a dedicated full-time city police liaison. There were also suggestions of having outside accountability for this, so having outside organizations that are paid to have support people, social workers, counselors at every police station in Chicago, so that when young people wind up in the police station, even because they're homeless or because they've been arrested, that there is someone there who does not represent law enforcement, who is able to interact with that person and really do an assessment with that person or connect that person into supportive care after they leave the police station. Let's see, get advocates to assist with cases at to assist with cases at each station, and then documentation for crimes and police action. So there was really a clear understanding from young people that police are not accountable for violence. We heard a lot of really just horrifying stories about police asking young people to exchange sex for not being arrested, or police particularly targeting young people in certain neighborhoods where they felt like they were really being told, even if they're not being arrested, that they're not welcome in these neighborhoods, just because of the harassment, the questioning, the asking for ID, the actual verbalization of, you should not be in this neighborhood, coming from law enforcement. And so they really wanted a better accountability system for law enforcement.
Any, just very quickly,
Yeah.
neighborhoods that they were brought up?
Well, overwhelmingly, people talked about Boys Town.
That's what I
yeah.
unfortunately thought.
Right. Yeah, and definitely it seemed like young people feel that police are working for people who have more wealth and who are adults that access that neighborhood. So not even necessarily residents, but they could really see how adults were not being treated the same way that they were, regardless of where they live in the city, but just people going to the Center on Halsted or going to Howard Brown, they witnessed that and felt that. Okay. So another great idea that came from young folks was to have required trainings for all judges, probation officers, DCFS workers, basically anybody who's connected to the legal system, required trainings. And this is connected to something that's a suggestion that comes later on, but having a youth justice council and having that youth justice council actually running those trainings. So the trainings are being done, again, from an outside accountability group, but also a youth-led group that can really design that program the way that works best for them. Lawyers are needed. There was actually several people that were like, the only person we know to call is Owen, and that's a problem. And I was like, yes, it is. That is a huge problem because one, I need sleep, and two, there are a lot of other great attorneys is the thing in Chicago. And why don't young people know how to access those folks? Why is it like finding the diamond in the rough of the attorney who will actually speak with you, who is a public defender or a state's attorney or whoever? Because we heard both sides, right? We heard young people saying, you know, I didn't feel respected when I was a defendant in court, and I really didn't feel respected when violence happened to me, and I needed the police to help me, right? So it's both sides of the problem.
Because you are, an attorney, is there currently a coalition of LGBTQ attorneys in the city that we don't know about?
I don't know if coalition is the right word.
Is there a cocktail hour that you all gather?
I wish there was a coalition. Vigilante Attorneys Association. There is an LGBT Bar Association. There's several. There's a national one. There's some Chicago-specific associations. I think there's a great idea of tapping into that existing group to see if folks could donate services. I think something that's really important that the young people also named is that there does need to be a significant amount of training, even with that free legal aid from other gay people, because young people had felt, even from a gay attorney, that they were not being understood, particularly if that attorney didn't have a race analysis, a class analysis, was coming from a really privileged position, maybe was one of the residents in Boys Town who had called the police on them, right? And so we need to go a little bit deeper than just thinking that all LGBT folks are in the same boat with each other, but I think that is an awesome idea, and it does exist. An idea was that we could have, kind of large LGBT expungement sessions, LGBT clinics on emancipation, how you do that, either from your parents or from DCFS or both. There were some issues of suing harassers or suing parents, or suing DCFS. So using the legal system and attorneys who know how to do that type of civil litigation to take the accountability structures we have and really use them to help young people. And definitely the issue of anti-discrimination law came up a lot. Young people feeling like they didn't understand if they were protected under the existing anti-discrimination law, and also it being really hard to prove that they were being discriminated against. So a lot of people saying, I got kicked out of the bathroom at the library because they said I was in the wrong bathroom. Is that discrimination? What can I do about it? And how can we stop that from happening? So I think more education around anti-discrimination law geared towards youth. Okay, transformative justice. So expanding transformative justice, right? One issue is that the only option is the police, and the police aren't working for young people. So there's both how can we change that, but also what can we do in the meantime. And so a lot of young people suggested transformative justice models. So looking at CPS, doing restorative justice, which is basically mediating a situation instead of calling the police and asking why did violence happen, why are you angry, why did you act this way, having the person who is experiencing violence have some explanation for why that happened to them, maybe some healing around that, as an alternative to calling the police or law enforcement. And then also, I think this is attached to the next slide, creating a peer jury system, or the youth council doing appeals or doing supervision in court as a form of transformative justice. So in other words, having your own community, other young people, be a part of the legal remedies that you're seeking, instead of it being a really adultist system, right, where adults are deciding what's best for you, but having other young people help with that. There was also a lot of talk of changing sentencing, right? This idea that once you're 18, you are just as liable for prostitution or low-level drug sales or loitering or retail theft than someone who is 55, right? And so a lot of young people were saying, what if you could not actually be convicted of these crimes that are really just survival crimes until you were 25 or 30? Right? And instead, the legal system responds with, wow, something must be happening for you. If this is the type of criminal activity we're seeing from you, how can we stop that from happening? So that's still connected to a transformative justice model, I think. And yeah, just more education for young people so that they understand their legal rights and can self-advocate better.
Great, thank you. Any questions? A lot of good information.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say about the Youth Justice Council idea was also related to our own institutions in our community, that every institution has its own policies, and a lot of the youth are very frustrated. Once they have gone through the appeals at that individual institution, they don't have any place else to go. And these are things about being banned or things they might have done that they would like to make up for, restore their ability to go into these institutions. So the Justice Council would also be about the youth feeling like they have a voice in the overall LGBT community about participation in the nonprofit sphere, or in the Chicago Metropolitan Sports Association, or whatever it is where they're having an issue, where they can appeal it up to this youth council and get resolution that is owned by both the adults and the youth.
So our experience in conversations with youth in Boys Town is that the treatment from police that you described is really race-based. So were there conversations at all about anti-racism training or anything around racial competency, shall we say?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was sort of across the board an issue that the youth absolutely expressed that this is an issue of racism, almost primarily, like in the example of Boys Town, right, where it's like a gay neighborhood, but it's clearly a race issue, it's clearly an age issue and a class issue, so yes, absolutely. And I think that's part of what young people were saying, is that we know that there's an understanding that trainings exist, they must, right? Like DCFS must get trained, at least there must be something in like a guidebook about this, right? But that's not enough, right? The training needs to get deeper into explaining the system so that people enforcing systems understand that the system is there, right? And if they don't, then that's really part of the problem. I think one other thing too that was interesting is that in our last session we had some law enforcement in the room with us, some CPD officers, and they also expressed a ton of frustration that they felt connected to all the other things that we're going to report back on today, right? Housing options, employment options, social safety nets, problems with DCFS, that they don't know what to do with LGBT homeless youth either, besides put them on a train, keep them in lockup, right? Or what? Because there's so few options. So I think, it's also important that, and this is me talking, not anything necessarily that came out of the workshops that we did, but I think it's important not to demonize individual officers, right? That is not, those officers, many officers want to do something good, but they're also within a system that's very hard to break out of. and then there are some officers.
You know, one thing that I think is interesting, if you look at the example that was in New York during the stop and frisk conversation, was that there were LGBTQ organizations that worked with the Urban League, that worked with the NAACP, because they realized that it was actually a lot of LGBTQ youth of color who were primary targets of the stop and frisk racism that was happening. And so perhaps, you know, we can borrow from that model, and the people in the city who are addressing you know, police discrimination and brutality within minority communities, we can find a partner with them to help address the issue that's going on in Boys Town, I'm assuming in other neighborhoods as well.
And when we talk about things like the criminalization of trans women of color, right, or the criminalization of LGBT people of color, that's a connection, right? There's a criminalization of people of color in our country, period, right? And then when we see within that marginalized groups, like folks with disabilities, mental disability, LGBT folks, then we see the numbers growing even more. And for example, in the national study on transgender people that came out from the National Center for Transgender Equality and NGLTF, they found that 54% of Black transgender people have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. 54%, right, have been incarcerated, not arrested, incarcerated, right? That is a huge, shocking number. So I feel like making that connection between racism and LGBT community, forming those alliances is just so important.
Of course, the dark side of that is pointing out the racism in our own community as we address that.
I mean, let's talk about that just for 1 second, because I know you talked about it a lot, about trans people being in lockup, and the experiences that they go through, which is almost, it borders on violent harassment. It's horrific. You have talked a little bit about it downstate, how, you know, trans women are housed in men's facilities, and or at the very least they are completely isolated, which is a punishment in the incarcerated system. Has that changed? Has there been discussion about this, about how trans and LGBT people are treated in incarceration?
Yeah, and that actually came up in some of the sessions on the first day with primarily youth, that at Cook County Jail, the policy has changed. It changed in 2011, and there is now a policy that basically creates a gender identity committee, which is a group of doctors and sheriffs who decide for every single individual transgender person that comes through the door, either self-identified or someone who, and this is a quote from the policy itself, there's reasonable suspicion they're transgender, which is like total criminalization language. But anyway, so reasonable suspicion of being trans. Then they are supposed to be evaluated by this committee, and transgender people are basically rubber stamped into being placed in protective custody in Cook County Jail under this policy. So most transgender women are currently in Division 6 jail, which is a medium maximum security men's jail, but they're in a wing and a unit on their own, removed from the general population. So it's basically a bunch of trans women, butch queens, maybe some gay boys who are all in that facility. And being in
I am hearing that there is abuse within that facility itself.
Well, there's always going to be abuse in jail and prison because it's an unsafe environment, right? Putting people in cages is never going to be safe. That's a really violent power dynamic, right? So there's ways that we can make it a little bit safer, I think, but I think there's a larger question about kind of using this language of safety inside of an incredibly violent, incredibly hateful, incredibly homophobic, right, environment. How can we ever actually make that safe? So there has been these little improvements, and it sounds like folks have had a little bit of better experiences there, although there is still report back that some people don't want to be placed in protective custody and they feel forced in protective custody. Some people want to be with men because they feel like they're protected from other inmates against correctional staff, right? Some people want to be with women. People have all different opinions about what's going to be safest for them. And ultimately, the policy puts the decision about trans people's safety in the hands of this committee, not in the trans person's hands themselves, right? We can't just say, this is where I feel safe, put me there, which I guess is another way that it could be tweaked, perhaps, right?
Another question, please? I saw a hand in back. No?
Just to follow up on that last comment, what are the mechanisms of accountability there for the Cook County Justice
Well, there's a couple of ways. I think that there are some formal and informal relationships on the outside, some outside accountability. I know that at the Trans Life Center, our Connect to Care case manager, Shannon Parker, she runs a support group every week at Cook County Jail with trans women who are inside, which provides a connection between what's happening inside of Cook County Jail to the Trans Life Center, maybe to other organizations. The goal is that we want to provide that connection when people are being released as well, but it's also been helpful for advocacy while people are inside. There is actually in the policy itself, they're supposed to review decisions about, the Gender Identity Committee is supposed to review decisions about treatment plans, housing location, cosmetics, hormone treatment, all that kind of stuff within 3 months of making their decision. Which is interesting in Cook County Jail because the average time that someone is there who's being charged with a misdemeanor is about 35, 40 days. So a 3-month review process doesn't really work unless they're being charged with felonies, and then they might be there upwards of a year, depending on whether or not they're demanding trial. So I think there's a lot of ways that there could be more accountability. I think outside accountability is important. I know that for most of us who have been doing this kind of advocacy for a long time, we were really surprised when this policy came out. Howard Brown wasn't consulted, very in depth to my understanding, right? There wasn't consultation with Lurie Children's Hospital, places that have been doing trans-specific healthcare for a while in Chicago and are experts in that, right? And so all of us were like, whoa, where did this come from? And part of where it came from is from the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which actually is the first time that we've had recognition federally that prison rape happens and that there are specific populations that are more vulnerable for sexual violence, and that mandates jails to have policies around that. So anyway, I think there could be more ways that we could use what's already happening in our community to have accountability for that particular program.
Last question.
I just have one question. Are we going to expand this towards the Illinois Department of Corrections too? Because this is where it makes the wrongdoing is more happening towards LGBT community. That I would feminine or more feminine than flamboyant in jail and being who they are as a person. So are we going to do it what's going on and then quickly move me from one jail to a worse position? You know what I'm saying? So what are we going to do about the law as far outside Illinois State? This is not just Cook County. We have a very big and broader situation here.
Right. It's a great question. The question is, what do we do about the Illinois Department of Corrections and people who are incarcerated in prison? And specifically transgender people, because right now transgender women predominantly are incarcerated in the state, and they are placed in men's facilities. And there is a new policy. So there's a couple of things. I could talk about this for a long time, but there's a new policy which requires a similar type of committee to review every single transgender person's placement, whether or not they're receiving hormone therapy, things like that. Again, it's a committee. Most of these folks work for the Department of Corrections or Wexford Health Services, which is a private contracted agency that provides medical care for the Department of Corrections. They do not actually meet with the prisoner themselves. It's a phone conference that happens to decide how that person's going to be treated. So there is a small step in the right direction. I think that step has actually come in part from the resilience of transgender women who are incarcerated, who have filed lawsuits and used the very few shreds of accountability that we have for prisoners' safety to their advantage, and really have taken that, and some organizations have supported them in doing that. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen in the Department of Corrections. Hopefully we can work on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Owen.
Thank you.